Thank you, Simon, for your introduction. It was incredibly kind. And thanks, guys, for covering a lot of my material. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to make reference to one comment that Simon made at the onset that I think is so crucial to this, and it was the importance of a world being able to watch an incident like this unfold. The world is watching is what President Obama, the phrase that he picked out, or the media picked out of what he said about Iran when it happened, and it's one we've heard over the decades as events, crises like this broke out. In Chicago in 1968, long before I was born, but maybe some of you remember that the crowds there chanted, "The world is watching," and it probably wasn't true. I mean, there were some people in the world who could see it, but it wasn't the world. And
Here, Nico, just lift that up just a little bit.
Oh, sure. Better, maybe. I figured it didn't matter. This will go into.
Just do what Tracy says. That's
yes,
what the rest.
Exactly.
That's what we all do at NDN.
It's tricky.
It is tricky.
Yeah. Tracy, do you need help?
No.
Tracy, you want me to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do the
Come on.
jacket.
How many NDNers does it take to put on? There we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
So, 20 years ago, I wanted to read this short piece from a Time magazine article that ran right after Tiananmen. It says, when word of the massacre first reached the University of Michigan, the 250 Chinese students studying there jumped into action. They purchased a fax machine. Daily summaries of Western news accounts and photographs were faxed to universities, government offices, hospitals, businesses in major cities in China to provide the alternative to the government's distorted press reports. The Chinese students traded fax numbers back home along the computer network that links them. The fax machine, or Twitter, is the new fax machine, so to speak, in Iran, and these technologies were deployed for that purpose, so that the world could watch. And it's a goal that's shared both by people around the world who are interested in the news value of it, by people, in the case of Iran, Iranian Americans here, for example, who wanted to lend their moral support to find out about family members and the towns that they grew up in. And then overwhelmingly by the people in Iran. If there's one consistent message that comes out of there to people outside of Iran, it is, please don't forget what we're doing here. When there isn't violence in the streets, don't turn away. Michael Jackson's death is important, but there are other very important things happening. And the great thing about Twitter is that it's helped us do that, and not just watch, but interact. And so I figured I'd run through a few of the reasons why that's taken place, and the value that it's had. It's had a number of functions. One, obviously, is the speed and the ability to access it remotely. The internet networks in Iran were very slow. It was hard to pass data along. Sending 140 characters was just right for the system that they had, and so in some sense it was a necessity if they wanted to get their word out beyond email. Another element of it was the ability to access it remotely. If you were at a demonstration, you could turn on your cell phone and send a tweet about what you were seeing, about the person being beaten in front of you, the escape route, the house where you could stay, and that was obviously of great value and something that you couldn't necessarily do with some other technological tools that are picking up in popularity now. And the other thing was the kind of strange story of how Twitter developed as a technology. It was rushed out with a lot of the technological backend not completely developed, and it made it the silver lining of that was that other sites could kind of gerrymander or jerry-rig their technology into Twitter's, and so when the Iranian government goes and tries to crack down on Twitter.com, people's access to that site, it doesn't matter at all. They can go to twitterrun.com or one of the dozens of other sites that use Twitter's technology, piggyback on top of it, and the Iranian government can never completely block those sites, the access to those sites. And so obviously when Iranians are trying to fight through the firewall that the government has produced, that technology makes it much easier. In terms of the functions, I mean, we've seen a lot of them so far. One of them is kind of a throwback to the beginnings of the internet. Twitter acted regarding the Iran uprising as a chat room. People who were interested in it but had no place, there wasn't a hub for them to go. You search in the hashtag for Iran, and it still is Iran election, and you see people talking about every aspect of what's going on there and responding to each other, developing relationships, friendships, and it allowed people who had no particular knowledge of the issue to jump in and take a look at what other people were saying. And in that sense, it was a little bit old school, relatively speaking. You could, it was more dynamic than a chat room because you could pull out. If you found people, it was obviously a bit of a mess when you had thousands. At some point, it was 6,000 tweets a minute on Iran being posted. If that was overwhelming, you could pick out a few people on Twitter who were reliable, who posted the news in the way that you like to see it, or provided regular links to interesting material, and could follow them without having to deal with the rest of the content. So it was flexible in that sense for users. It also served as an aggregation tool. People, if you were lucky enough to find a YouTube video that hadn't been seen of some of the events that had taken place in the streets there, you put it up on Twitter, and suddenly other people wanted to help the information get out, so they would retweet it and distribute it far and wide to millions of people, and it was a way for folks to get informed about what was happening. There was a fundraising value to it for some. There's a group of tech gurus who are working on a program called Haystack, which allows Iranians to break through the firewall there. They needed to get some folks they were working with to San Francisco to have a meeting there, and didn't have the money to pay for it. They needed them there the next day. They went on Twitter using the Iran election hashtag and raised the money very quickly. In this case, it wasn't a prime function of it, but it definitely played a role. And of course, the news value of the tweets that were coming from there. A lot of it, of course, was unreliable. You couldn't confirm what was happening. But it's been interesting as Iranians on Twitter have slowly stopped using. They've either lost the technological capacity to do it, they've been arrested, they're too afraid to use it. The news media's ability to get information out of there has dwindled right along with it, and it was always fascinating to me during the crisis. The media in the U.S. for the first, up till like 11 a.m. on the East Coast, they would be reporting that it was quiet in Iran that day. And then you'd start to see the tweets show up and some of the YouTube videos appear. And by the end of the day, it was, this was a really violent day in Iran, and there were protests all over the place, and thousands of people were on the streets. And it was such a lesson, and you can only imagine how many times this happens all over the world, that incredible news is taking place, and the media's assumption, for some valid reasons, if they don't have direct evidence, obviously even if there's an expectation that something might happen, if they don't have those firsthand accounts, it's as if it didn't happen. In fact, the assumption is nothing happened. And so even though a lot of the information coming over on Twitter couldn't be confirmed, it was at least a heads up that traditional news outlets ought to figure out what did happen, that there might have been, there was some smoke, they should see if there's a fire. And it gave professional news gatherers a very, very valuable tip to try and figure out what took place, that there may have been major news. I think the most important element of Twitter, though, beyond all those, was the personal interaction that people were able to experience in all this. It wasn't just that you could turn on Al Jazeera, although Al Jazeera did pretty poor coverage of this. You could turn on a network from the region and see people's accounts about what was taking place there. But there was nothing like getting to know a person, an Iranian on Twitter. You didn't know their name necessarily, but you followed their writings over the course of days. They would share personal information. They would share how they were feeling, what it was like for their country, their neighborhood to be falling apart underneath them. And it changed the way millions of Americans thought about Iran. Instead of Iran being Ahmadinejad and that link being basically the most people knew about the country, it was instead a person on Twitter named Persian Kiwi who would send out, every night it was a stream of dozens of tweets about what he was hearing from people in other cities, what he was hearing outside his window, how loud the chants were at night. And it really made, again, it wasn't just that the world was watching, but they were getting to know people and interacting with them. And it made it unlike any other global crisis. And I think, of course, this will continue to develop with other events around the world. I think for the Huffington Post and for people like Andrew Sullivan, who followed this closely, and Robert Mackey at the New York Times, I think what we saw develop in terms of news gathering was the beginning of a new type of aggregation. I think you can basically chart it back to, I think there's basically 4 stages. In the early and mid-'90s, you saw newspapers and organizations with major resources get online and provide news basically in the way that they were doing in their newspapers and magazines. In the mid-'90s and late '90s, you saw aggregation sites pop up like the Drudge Report and the Huffington Post, which took a lot of used a lot of their content from the papers, but did it in a way that was ideologically more interesting, had some passion behind it, had some personality. There were a variety of reasons why these aggregation sites took off, but that was a big part of it. The third stage was social networks and platforms developing as a source for news. And now you see the next level of aggregation. There's too much news for one reporter or a team of reporters to track down. The New York Times has 9 people covering Sotomayor's hearings today. For them to track down everything that's happening in Iran, I don't know what it's impossible. And so you have this development of community news gathering. Everyone who was covering the Iran election closely was relying on people emailing, sending us documents, translating documents. It was a huge volunteer squad of people providing news, helping us aggregate it. So if you didn't have a lot of time, you wanted the news that was most reliable, most interesting, provided the best sense of what was going on there, you could turn to people, hopefully like us, and get an aggregated, curated collection of that news, pulling in from social networks, from traditional news sources, and from personal accounts from readers. I guess the last thing I would say is, regarding Iran, Twitter has received too much attention. I think just as important to Iran becoming a global story was YouTube, because most people, or at least a very large proportion of them, still receive a lot of their news from television, and without those videos that captured the sense of the scene so well, the shaky cameras, and obviously some of the brutal violence that took place, it wouldn't have jumped over from, you'd have Wolf Blitzer with a map of Iran or maybe some photos, but without those videos, I don't think the story would have taken off in the way it did. Twitter helped those videos reach a wider audience online, but I don't think Twitter alone would have made the story the way it was. But it was crucial, and I hope I explained why.
Thank you, Nico.
Thanks.